Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. Today, we are going to dive into a little bit of a combo story. This is sort of the life and career of Guy Clark, but we're going to cover a little bit of his wife, Susanna, Townes Van Zandt, and Blaze Foley. So stick around for that. All right, but first, I've got some dates coming up, so come on out and see me. We will be, October 16th is the big trip to Nashville. I'll be playing on the Ryman Plaza stage ahead of the Jason Isbell show, so that's going to be great. And then November 1st, I'll be at the R-Wagon Bar in Browns Valley for a Halloween party. And then November 11th, I'll be at Harrah's Northern California in Ione. So come on out and see me. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at TylerandCo_marketing and tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything, when he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. Marketing to capture your big day. So visit tylerandcofilms.com for all your photography needs. That's tylerandcofilms.com. All right, so this week we're talking about Guy Clark, but really what I want to kind of try to focus on is the Texas folk music scene of the 60s and 70s into the 80s here, because there was this weird bit of magic around a couple of these characters that, kind of Guy Clark became the main vessel because he lived the longest, but it was really this whole group of guys, and they didn't all know or like each other, but the total result of their relationships is just some great music that came out of this part of the world. So it kind of starts off with Guy Clark. And so he's this character where he when he starts playing guitar when he's a kid, he gravitates towards like classical training kind of and then Mexican mariachi music. And so he's very and he's self-taught, but he's technically trained in that sort of acoustic style. And that kind of sets the tone for the folk music scene kind of going forward here. And he's very, they really lean into the esoteric songwriting kind of poet gear that a lot of these guys stick in. So heavy acoustic guitar picking and poetic writing. That's like, you're in Texas now. And so as he's working at guitar, luthier shops and stuff, he's working at a dobro factory at one point. So he's a technically very gifted guy as far as guitars go. And he starts to kind of come into his own, on the writing scene here. So he, just in the Texas scene, but early on, he befriends Townes Van Zandt. And there's lots of people that have done a ton of, documentaries and everything on Townes Van Zandt. He's his own crazy character. But for this episode, we're going to kind of focus on a few of these characters at the same time. So him and Townes become good buddies. And they're touring together. They're playing shows together. Townes is like this. If you look at interviews with him and you look at kind of the way his life went, he was this very free spirit type dude, but also extremely tortured. So he's left to his own devices. He's very depressed and very tortured, but he was a fiercely loyal friend to the people that he was close to. And it almost seems like he would use that as a reason to stick around, because he was super self-destructive and very, he was this kind of non sequitur of his two sides of his personality really clashed with each other. And, but anyway, he was a very, very loyal friend, and he would follow Guy around. Like, Guy would move. Like, Guy moved to San Francisco. Townes went with him just to do it. And then when they moved back to Texas, Townes came back with him. Like, he kind of placed his whole life around what Guy was doing, early on at least. So, in the early part of their, hanging out, I think this would have been in the early 60s. Yeah, so he meets Townes in the mid-60s. And so somewhere in there, Guy had gotten married and had a kid. But that marriage ends somehow. So there's not a lot of detail on that, but his first marriage ends in divorce. Pretty quick after that, he meets a girl named Bunny. And I think it was Bunny Tally. Tally. And so they start dating, and I think she was in San Francisco, and she had a younger sister named Susanna, or Susanna, I guess is, yeah, I gotta get that right. But, so Susanna is Bunny's younger sister, and she talks about the first time she met Guy Clark, because he came in the house because he was dating Bunny, and she talks about being like, and it was the first time he walked in, it was him and Townes Van Zandt. And they were both these tall, lanky cowboy characters. And they walked in the house, and Susanna had been painting because she was a songwriter, but she was a painter. She was just this crazy artistic person, and she had a bunch of different outlets for that. And but Townes walked in the room and just immediately starts nerding out about paint with her, and so did Guy. And so suddenly the conversation became like there was a painting she was working on an easel when the guys walked in, and she was complaining about how she didn't know how to bring the foreground, back away from the subject of the painting. And suddenly both these guys are standing in her apartment giving her art tips on how to, you could use this color and you could do this shading, and so she felt, really accepted really early on by these two guys that walked in, one of which was Guy dating her older sister Bunny. And she remembers feeling drawn to Guy, but that was her sister's boyfriend, kind of forbidden fruit. So she doesn't do anything to pursue that. But she doesn't pursue Townes either, which kind of confuses me for reasons that are coming up here. Because in that initial meeting, she's drawn to Guy. And so some time goes by, and Bunny ends up, this is where tragedy enters the chat here, because Bunny ends up pregnant, and then they move back to Texas, and soon thereafter, while pregnant, Bunny commits suicide, and it just crushes Guy Clark. Because she's pregnant with Guy Clark's baby, and she commits suicide and just crushes Guy all the way to the ground, and also Susanna. And so in the aftermath of that tragedy, Susanna and Guy develop, they kind of lean on each other during that time, and it sort of cements them, that relationship becomes romantic pretty quickly after that. They kind of grieve together, and then things get romantic, and they stay together, from here on out, basically. But almost immediately, it's the 60s, I guess, but so they get married in 1972 but immediately, pretty early on in their relationship, Townes is still around, and where Guy can be this kind of gruff Texas, hard-nosed guy sometimes, Townes was the opposite. He was this really sensitive, artsy type, and he was, easier to talk to, I guess. And so she describes having Guy was her, husband, and Townes was her soulmate, which that seems like that could get complicated pretty quick. But, and the way she would talk about him in interviews and in diary entries later, she's very affectionate about Townes. And they were, Towns described her as like a sister and she described him like a brother, but everybody around felt like weird about that whole thing. And, like later on when people would gather at their house, like Steve Earle was really close to both these guys also. And Steve Earle talks about how like Towns and Susanna were like, definitely everybody was trying to impress Susanna, but Towns had something special going on, and it would have almost ruined it if anybody called it out, that it would have made everything too awkward. So everybody just kind of kept their mouth shut and pretended like that was normal. But there was definitely some like weird kind of love triangle thing going on. Towns said at the time, and I think he wrote it in a poem, I think, but that he would never, do anything to pursue his best friend's girl. Like that was like at least from what he's saying, they never did anything while Guy and Susanna were married. So, but like I said, everybody she was this beautiful, artsy, creative, assertive. She didn't take any crap from anybody. And she was like dedicated to the idea that she could like hang with these guys as good as anybody else. So she was doing the same amount of coke they were. She was drinking the same amount of whiskey they were. She was right there with them. She wasn't this like standoffish wife character that was trying to slow anybody down. She was right in the muck with them. And, eventually, it does start to cause some tension. Like apparently there was one time where, Guy got upset because Towns said something to Susanna in front of him, like implying an inside joke at Guy's expense. And Guy stormed off to the garage, grabbed a hammer, a board, and a bunch of nails, stormed right past them into his room and nailed the door shut behind him and the window shut. And I mean, he's like coked up and drunk, and this is all like lots of chemicals involved here. But he nails himself into this room. He sits down and he writes a song that, turns out good, I guess. But so it's kind of, they joke about like, oh, well, at least we got the song out of the deal. But so that's the kind of thing going on in the house, because Towns lived with them after they got married in, I think, 1972. Towns was the best man at the wedding, and he lived with them for like almost a year after that. I think it was like 8 months or something. And, but anyway, but there's always this kind of weird love triangle thing going on. And with some other members of the band too. Like there were other guys floating around, producers and guys helping, Guy Clark with his music career, which by the way, this whole time, their careers kind of take turns lurching forward. It's not really, even across the board. Because at one point, Towns is asking Guy for advice on how to succeed. Like, how did you get these connections made and stuff? And there's a bunch of really weird, cool, but kind of out of context, very weird recordings where, like, Susanna had this habit of clicking the tape recorder on just during conversations. You do it at, like, Christmas or certain other events, and so you can hear these conversations, and in one of them, Towns is like, I'd like to ask you for some advice on how to get a record deal or how to get some of this stuff going. How do I get myself going as a songwriter? And Guy Clark is telling Towns Van Zandt, hey man, you had a shot and you pissed off these two guys that I brought in to see you. And they really liked your stuff and they wanted to work with you, but you got too drunk and you wouldn't shut up about what you didn't like. And you kind of drove them off. And I really tried to hook you up there. But Towns had no memory of that happening. And you start to see pretty early on the first glimpses of the thing that would eventually kill Towns Van Zandt. Like he would go on benders that were like would kill most people, and he would do them all the time. Like the amount of whiskey they would drink, the amount of coke they were doing, the frequency with which they were doing that was they were just burning it down pretty often. And it, it negatively impacted his career because Towns would get on stage. Towns had like two kinds of shows. It was either this like religious experience, great time that everybody would talk about, or it was a disaster where he was like melting on stage, forgetting words, slumping down in his chair. Like if Towns was tying one on, people were mad, wanting their money back, He was getting fired by promoters. He was getting, doing the whole thing that we've covered at length with other artists. Same kind of deal. But when he was on, and he was a great songwriter and a great poet, and people loved him. So, but Guy's career kind of takes off, especially when he L.A. Freeway gets picked up by Jerry Jeff Walker, and that's kind of his first real look at success. And that was from a songwriting perspective. L.A. Freeway was Guy Clark. He was half asleep in the back of a car in Los Angeles, and wakes up and kind of, has the thought to himself, if I could just get out of here without getting killed or caught. And then he kind of lays down, and then he goes, oh, I probably ought to write that down. And he pulled, I think it was like a piece of a plastic or a paper bag or something. He found some piece of something to write on and just wrote, if I can get off this LA freeway without getting killed or caught. Folds it up, puts it in his shirt pocket. And that song doesn't get written until he's in Nashville 2 years later. Like it's not an instant thing. It's one of those things where he writes down it on this little, scrap of paper, and that thought just keeps brewing in his head until it's, it doesn't come to fruition for a couple of years. But when it does, it's great. And he has a few songs like that, and he was big about, if something comes to you, write it down. Because if you don't write it down, you're going to forget it. If you do write it down, you'll have it later, and you never know when it might turn into something. And, but yeah, so his career, he starts to get some stability going. Susanna also is writing songs. She doesn't write as many, but her song to success ratio was way higher than Guy or Towns, and that started to create a little bit of jealousy there. And then at one point, Guy leaves, so they kind of split up. They don't actually get divorced, I don't think, but they split up. She gets her own apartment. I think she had a song that Emmylou Harris did, and the royalties from that gave her enough money to get her own apartment. And she did it kind of to prove a point to Guy Clark. I'm not relying on you for this. You can't treat me like I am. She moves out, which crushes Guy in a way, but he talked about it later as if I think she did it to prove the point, and it worked, because I didn't think she had the nerve or the resources to do that, and she did. Well, during this time, things get pretty weird and pretty, she starts kind of going through Guy's friend circle. Her and Towns, have a physical relationship at that point. And, I don't know about Steve Earle, but a couple of the other guys in the group also. And so I think it's 6 years of them being separated. And she, like I said, she has a brief relationship with Towns during that time, but she's talking about him he would call her every day at 8:30 in the morning just to ask her about how things were going. He was bringing her breakfast in bed. He was this very kind of sweet character to her, but they don't it doesn't seem to they stayed in a romantic relationship for very long, I don't think. I'm not exactly sure for how much of that time. I think she was just living her free life over there, and Towns is one of the guys that she bounces off of. And, but they stayed really close, and they stayed, they maintained that soul connection that she was talking about. And she's she's writing stuff down in poems and diary entries and letters that if I was Guy, that takes a pretty secure dude to just know that and keep hanging out with Towns Van Zandt, because his wife was in love with Towns and is talking about how her connection with him is different than anybody else and all this other stuff. But anyway, it's all a little bit of a weird mess. But eventually she ends up back with Guy. But then somewhere in here, let's see, 1975. Because we're talking about the Texas music scene. Like I said, these guys met. These are both Texas guys. And Susanna as well. And their culture that they're developing is very Texas oriented. Another guy enters the scene here, and this is Blaze Foley. And Blaze Foley, at this stage of the game, had been on his own. We really should probably do a whole episode just on Blaze Foley, because his road to here is full of interesting stuff and full of life changes, and he's kind of this really esoteric, weird character. But he shows up in the Texas music scene as this kind of wild card. He, again, very poetic, very, heavy finger picking acoustic guy. And, but he's known for his songwriting. And, his relationship, so him and Townes become really good friends. And that relationship isn't that good for either one of them. Because, while it is musically legendary, and there's, they kind of help each other survive certain things, Blaze he earned the nickname the Duct Tape Messiah because he was just super into duct tape for whatever reason. He would put it all over his clothes and his boots, and he saw somebody with a silver tip suit, and so he just put duct tape on his lapels to make it kind of look like that. And just, he was, like I said, kind of a weird dude. He would pull garbage out of dumpsters to draw on. He was not only a songwriter, but he was a good artist, just making all these drawings of birds and all this other stuff, but lots of heavy colors, and most of that was done on stuff that he pulled out of dumpsters. And he was always couch surfing. He never really, experienced a ton of success. So initially, there's this weird story where initially Blaze Foley somehow gets a record deal, and he ends up at Muscle Shoals and records an album at Muscle Shoals, which Muscle Shoals is its own historical cool thing that we might cover someday. But so Blaze ends up there. He records an album. Before the album drops, the FBI raids somebody, the producer or something, because he's dealing a lot of cocaine apparently back in the day. And they seized the masters and a bunch of records that had been made of Blaze Foley's stuff. So Blaze all of a sudden all that work is toast. He doesn't have a company to work for anymore, and his records that he just went and made are gone. So he's just back in Austin working the local music scene, telling people that the FBI has his records. And everybody kind of goes, ha ha ha, whatever. Eventually he gets them back. He somehow, apparently somebody from the FBI or something calls him up and is like, hey, we have all this stuff in evidence, but it's got your name on it. Do you want this? And he just says, yeah, sure. So he ends up with this giant stack of records that he ends up, the end of that story is he's selling them out of the back of his brother's truck for $1 a piece or something, or just giving them away. He doesn't do very much with that. But basically, Blaze Foley becomes this character notoriously known for, he was homeless most of the time. He's couch surfing. He's digging through dumpsters. He's selling records for almost nothing. He's, but he's showing up to these gigs and he's writing these really profound songs, and he's kind of loved all over town. And he had his wife, who there's another funny story. His wife's name was Sybil. And when they first get together, her dad, and this was before Blaze was Blaze. He went through a couple of name changes here. When he was born, his name was Mike. And then he was I guess he was this kind of overweight kid. He ends up working at this venue. I think it was called The Mill. People started calling him Deputy Dog because he was kind of built like that, and he wore a similar hat, and but they meant it kind of tongue in cheek. It wasn't a fun nickname that he didn't like that. But then somewhere in there, he loses a bunch of weight, and he actually writes a song about it. I think it's I Won't Be Your Fat Boy No More or something like that is the title of the song. He loses all this weight. Suddenly they quit calling him Deputy Dog, and they just started calling him the Deputy, which he was kind of cool with. He kind of shed the tongue-in-cheek part of his nickname, and he became the Deputy, which is what everybody was calling him when he meets his later wife, Sybil. And she tells this funny story about how her dad, because they were Jewish, her dad wanted Blaze to convert to Judaism. And Blaze was all about it. He was like, oh, sure, I'll give it a shot. And he's, dad gives him this stack of books, and he's going to start the process of, converting to Judaism. And they meet the rabbi at a restaurant for whatever reason, which was probably kind of walking into a buzzsaw here. But so they go to meet this rabbi for a lesson of some kind. They sit down, Blaze has got his books, he's going to learn about Judaism, and he orders sausage with his breakfast and kind of ruins the whole thing. So pretty quickly after that, they bail on the whole converting to Judaism thing, and him and Sybil just do this like half ceremony with their friends and do the jumping the broom thing. And so it's basically just in the sight of their friends, they're married. And, but that's kind of, like I said, after that, once he meets Townes Van Zandt, Sybil kind of has enough pretty quick, and she ends up leaving because him and Townes would just pour gas on each other when it came to, drug use and drinking and stuff. Like it really, when Blaze would go home I think he was, he would go back to his family, I think in Tennessee, they later described that they don't even think he liked Texas that much. Like, he would go there for his music, but then he would have to escape to home to kind of dry out and center and kind of be able to keep going. And then he would go back to Texas, and by the time they saw him again, he was kind of strung out again, and it was not going well. But like I said, him and Townes are palling around. Now, Blaze and Guy Clark never get that close. And actually, Guy Clark says some kind of disparaging stuff about him later. But so, Townes Van Zandt is the tie-in. So you've got Townes Van Zandt, who has, he sort of breaks into the mainstream when he writes Poncho and Lefty. And that gets picked up by Willie Nelson and Merle Haggard. Not Merle Haggard, I'm sorry. Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings. And that's sort of the introduction. So, because you got to remember, Willie is a Texas guy, and he always maintained an interest in the Texas music scene, because that's where he started off as a radio DJ before he moved to Nashville in, I think, 1962 or something. And so Willie somehow becomes aware of Townes Van Zandt, introduces that world to Waylon, Merle, Johnny Cash, Chris Christopherson, the whole Highwaymen crowd. And they all immediately, recognize the greatness that's kind of hiding in this little corner of Texas. And so they start getting some wins on the board. I think Merle Haggard records If I Could Only Fly, which was Blaze Foley's song. Willie Nelson obviously did Poncho and Lefty. Guy Clark had his own successes going at the time. But they all three kind of, the momentum that carried one sort of picked up the others in the wake. And then I think Roseanne Cash, was working with Suzanne at one point writing songs. And because Suzanne started working with, I think, Roseanne Cash and Emmylou Harris, who this is kind of post Graham Parsons finding Emmylou Harris. After Graham dies, she ends up in this other orbit of people, and she ends up working with Guy Clark and Townes Van Zandt and Susanna Clark. So we're starting to kind of bounce into some of our other stories here. And so, but anyway, so success kind of finds them, and this is the golden age of the Texas music scene. It ends pretty early and pretty tragic because, like I said, and you got to imagine Blaze Foley and Townes Van Zandt both, but especially Blaze, he was he kind of like Chris Christopherson. He loved an underdog, but he did not have the same tact that Christopherson had. And he would he's obviously digging into political issues. He's writing songs about Ronald Reagan and about, he just hated Republicans and the whole thing. He was really concerned with the goings on in the world at the time. And people would warn him hey man, maybe cool it on the political stuff. And he was like, nope, there are people being hurt that don't have a voice, and I'm going to be their voice. And it was you're costing yourself a lot of success here. He didn't care. He was going to write the songs he was going to write. And that same attitude he applied down to one-on-one interactions with people. If he got to where he didn't like you because he thought you were a bully or something, he would torture you. There was some incident that happened in a bar where there was this guy being a loudmouth, and they were supposed to be quiet during the show. Blaze Foley just spits on this guy from across the room. That guy wheels around and beats Blaze out of his senses, but Blaze didn't care. And then Blaze got 86 from the place they were in, but he kind of wore it as a badge of honor because like he was defending, what he was defending against what he perceived as this real, disrespect from this guy. But that's just kind of the kind of person that Blaze was. Up until the point where, let's see here, I think it was 19, where did it go? Let's see. I think it was in the, dang it, where did I write it down? Yeah, 1989. Okay. So 1989, after, maintaining some successes and kind of developing his name in the Texas music scene, Blaze Foley is killed in a confrontation with his friend's son. So basically, his friend was this older gentleman who had this kid who was an adult. I mean, his son was an adult at the time, but Blaze became aware that there was some elder abuse kind of stuff going on, that the kid was like taking his dad's social security checks and he was kind of like, and being physically violent to him and, just not a good home scenario there. Well, Blaze gets wind of this and shows up at the house and has this confrontation with the son, who shoots and kills Blaze Foley. The son says it was self-defense. He's in his house, so like here's Blaze, come to rescue his friend. But when the son shoots and kills Blaze, he's able to claim self-defense and never spends a day in prison, which is not great. Not great for the music scene. This is where you start to get some lore, because when Blaze Foley is buried, supposedly, this is a story that Towns tells that who knows if it's true or not, but it'd be fun to believe it's true. Towns had pawned, Blaze had pawned a guitar, and so he had a pawn slip for, I think it was Towns' guitar, actually. And he's buried with that pawn slip in his jacket. So Towns and a bunch of friends dig Blaze up to get that pawn ticket back after he's killed. So, like I said, who knows if that's really true, but it seems like something Towns would do. And, but that does spiral Towns. I mean, this is 1989. So the next few years is just, Towns Van Zandt really, really leans into the drinking and the drug use and stuff. And any of the successes that he gets from here on out are kind of marked by these just getting in his own way constantly. But he's got this friendship going with Guy Clark still and Steve Earle and all these guys, and they're doing, the performances that come out of this are great. I mean, there's one, they do a performance at the Bluebird that was Guy Clark, Towns Van Zandt, and Steve Earle, and that was in 1995. And so like I said, he's hanging in there through these years, but everybody understands he has a problem. And like I said, it's crushed his spirit in such a way to where in 1997, January 1st, the same day that Hank Williams died, not same year, obviously, but same day of the year, Towns Van Zandt dies in his house. And he died, there's this really dramatic moment where his wife, Janine, is on the phone with Susanna Clark when her son notices that Towns isn't breathing anymore. And so there's this, crushing moment of realization that Towns is dead. But before that, there's a bunch of these tape recordings they're really heartbreaking to listen to, with Susanna Clark talking about how much she loves Towns, but he's killing himself and he wants to die and there's nothing anybody can do. And if, until Towns changes his mind, they're just going to have to watch from a distance as he kills himself slowly, basically. And she was 100% right. So when he died, it wasn't a shock to anybody. As tragic as it was, not surprising. So Blaze's death sort of dominoes into Towns' death, which dominoed into Susanna's problems here. Because then, after this, she starts developing... And remember, she's a lady that could hang. She was doing coke with everybody. She was drinking with everybody. She was in the same league as all these other guys. She develops a pain pill problem right after this, which seems to hit a lot different. Because she starts complaining about back pain, and she's can't do shows because of her back pain, and her friends are initially pretty, like, oh, you tough it out, you're fine. Like, I've seen this happen to other people. You want the pills. This isn't a real back pain problem. Like, get your act together. But she doesn't. And she ends up, like, bedridden for the next 15 years of her life until she dies. She never recovers from the death of Townes Van Zandt. Really triggers that for her, I think. Because her diary entries and stuff, and she writes letters and stuff, like, her written works after that leave very little room for speculation about what was bumming her out. And it was the death of Townes Van Zandt, who she had always regarded as her soulmate character. So when he's gone, she never recovers. Now, all of this is happening to Guy Clark, because these are all his friends. And, like I said, Blaze Foley and him, there was some kind of tension there, because at one point it might have been that Bluebird show, actually. I'm not 100% sure about that. But they're sitting around playing, and I think it was Steve Earle and Townes Van Zandt took turns playing Blaze Foley songs back and forth. And when they handed the guitar to Guy, he was like, I hope you guys don't expect me to be playing Blaze songs. That guy was an asshole. And everybody kind of like, oh, okay. Like, that just kind of, nobody challenged him on it, but it was like, okay, so Guy is not a Blaze Foley fan for whatever reason. Maybe has something to do with the negative effect that him and Townes had on each other. Who knows? But anyway, so he made his feelings, pretty well known there. But so after Townes' death, and then Susanna, is, like I said, she's bedridden for 15 years after the fact. And then she dies from cancer. And I think, let's see, what year was that? That would have been 2012. She died from cancer when she was 70 years old. And, but along the way, it's kind of where I'm clocking this is like that whole period leading up to 2014, Guy Clark's life was this bizarre, like, lonely period of success where, like, his friends are all, dying. His wife is bedridden, but now he's getting the success and recognition that he'd always wanted. Like we're talking a lot about, like, the personal side of this stuff here. His professional career had been a grind up to that point, and he had just started getting where he wanted to be when all the wheels started falling off of all of his relationships around him. And he goes through this time period after Townes' death where it must have been a very, very strange time, because Steve Earle is still there, and, like, it's not like he doesn't have any friends, but, like, it was post-tragedy, and while his wife is bedridden is when he finally gets the thing that he's after. And it must have just been such a weird time for him, because it's like, it makes you wonder how much you can really enjoy the dream, if that's the backdrop to it. And then, then Guy himself is diagnosed with lymphoma, and he dies in 2016. But he won a bunch of awards before that. So he's winning Grammys, he's winning Lifetime Achievement Awards, he's getting, like, he's winning all the things that, as a songwriter you could ever want as far as recognition goes, especially for a guy who never capitulated to the Nashville writing scene. Like, because you got to imagine this is like, this is all through the classic, he was there from the time it was George Jones and Johnny Cash, all the way through the 90s, where you've got, like, your Alan Jackson, Joe Diffie period going on. Like, he saw all of those phases, and he never, like, broke into that gear. He never was just writing songs for the radio. He stayed very dedicated to his craft. He stayed very, like, who cares who's listening? This is what the art calls for. This is what we're going to make. And it finally paid off for him, but it took a long time, and he had to weather a lot of tragedies to get there. And, but anyway, so very, so when you go back and listen to some of these songs, you got to remember that's what they're written about. Like, Townes Van Zandt's writing songs about Blaze Foley. Guy's writing songs about Townes. Susanna's writing songs about Townes and Guy. And it's all this, like, they don't shy away from their stories, and they don't put very much work into making it, like, metaphoric, so you can't really tell who they're talking about. They're very, like, on-the-nose poets. And when you go back and listen to all those songs in that context, it kind of gives you a different view of that time in the world. And really, these guys, this group that we're talking about, is the reason we have the vibrant kind of folk scene that we do today. Because without these guys, I mean, you don't get Lyle Lovett, Robert Earl Keen. You don't get, like, the whole Texas scene doesn't develop the same way. And those guys gave rise. I mean, John Prine was a huge Blaze Foley fan. Like, those guys kind of bounced off each other. Like, John Prine recorded Clay Pigeons, which is a Blaze Foley song, and he described it as the song he what did he say? He said it's a song, the song I always wanted to write but never did, I think is what he called it. But anyway, so it's just, you can see the impact from this small little pocket of people in Texas stretching out across into today, where we have, you know, all the John Prine disciples like Sturgill Simpson and Jason Isbell and, you know, like guys like that. They're all of their musical lineage leads back to Texas in the 70s and 60s. And yeah, they were just like really artistic, funny guys. Like, some of these recordings you'd catch, you know, them just saying stuff that they weren't writing down. That's just the way they talked. And it was just so funny. Like at one point there was when that recording was on, I think it was Townes Van Zandt. It's a little unclear who's talking, but I think it was Townes Van Zandt said, he was just joking around. He was like, I might be a lonely schizophrenic, but at least I have each other, which is just like the funniest way to, you know, put that out there. And then Blaze Foley had a quote that I love that I wrote down, and I'm going to butcher this, but Blaze Foley's thing was, you don't always get what you go after, but you do get what you wouldn't have got if you hadn't gone after what you didn't get, which is just kind of an over the top way of saying, you know, shoot for the stars, you might land on the moon kind of thing. And, but yeah, I just like, you just kind of get a little glimpse into the way their brains worked and their little poetic way of seeing the world. And yeah, like I said, you can see that the lineage of that thought process all over music today. So that's Guy Clark and the Guy Clark and Friends. So thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next week.